All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Gundersen. I have the absolute privilege of moderating what I know will be a mind-blowing session. I'm principal and senior vice president with Camoin Associates. It's the nation's only full-service economic development consulting company. Many of you, however, know me as one of you, as a practitioner. If I have any claim to fame in this profession, it would be that I've directed economic development at the most senior level for more governors of more states than anyone else. This includes 2 northern states and 2 southern states as Commissioner of New York State Economic Development and as COO, President, and CEO of the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. Now, joining me on stage are 2 incredibly fascinating individuals who will share their thoughts on today's space economy and where we might be headed in the future. What we want to do is to better understand today what's going on up there and how it relates to what's going on down here in terms of what it means for economic development and how each of you and your communities might be able to take advantage of this, what it's going to mean for your future as economic developers. So let me begin by introducing our panelists, our speakers. Kelli Kedis Ogborn, in her role as Vice President of Space Commerce for the Space Foundation. Kelli leads space initiatives that empower countries, individuals, and companies to carve out their niche and thrive in the rapidly expanding space economy. Prior to joining Space Foundation, Kelli was President and Chief Operating Officer of Advanced Rockets Corporation, an aerospace company specializing in hypersonic flight. President and CEO of HS Troconis, a consulting company specializing in technology commercialization, and was contracted as the congressional liaison to the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. We know it as DARPA. There, she provided advice to senior leadership and the technical offices on congressional engagement strategies to maintain that agency's, DARPA's reputation as a premier science and technology organization. She holds an international security and conflict resolution bachelor's degree from San Diego State University. And that wasn't enough, so she went after another bachelor's degree from Stockholm University in political science, and a master's degree from in government and security studies from Johns Hopkins University. And we have Alexander MacDonald. Get this, he helped establish the strategy for NASA's return to the moon, the Artemis program. And he did that through public-private partnerships. And he was the program executive for the International Space Station National Lab. He was also the former executive of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, former research faculty member at Carnegie Mellon, and he has worked for the University Space Research Association while at NASA's Ames Research Center, where he worked on small satellite mission design. Alex didn't want me to read the next portion, but I'm going to do it. He's so down to earth, but he's also brilliant. He received his undergraduate degree in economics from Queen's University in Canada, his master's degree in economics from the University of British Columbia, and was a Clarendon Scholar at the University of Oxford, where he obtained his doctorate in the long-run history of American space exploration. He is an inaugural TED Senior Fellow and received the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics History Manuscript of the Year. But first, I turn your attention to the screen where we're going to just give an overview on what some of the fundamentals of this conversation will be. So you're not totally lost. We just want to set the stage. What is the space economy? We're going to use that phrase a lot today. Here are some of the activities that make up that space economy. It, of course, includes exploration, satellite services, of which there are tens of thousands of satellites, launch services, and of course we've heard about tourism, space mining, manufacturing, and so forth and so on, but a lot of research and development. And Kelli and Alex are going to put this all in perspective. I asked our Camoin researchers to do a little bit of digging, and this is what's available, public and proprietary numbers on the economy. Kelli, actually, she'll talk about this. The Space Foundation is releasing today some new numbers that are going to come out on global economy in terms of space. But you can see here the Southeast is very well positioned. This aligns with university assets, but it's also with technology, with manufacturing, and of course, location. In terms of manufacturing in the South, this corresponds very closely with the data we heard this morning from Ernst & Young, where about 40% of the manufacturing facilities are in the South. Total revenue and employment, about 1/3 located presently in the Southeast. Some major players, you've read about them, you may know about them. Maybe we can help put that in context as well. A lot of activity in the Southeast. And then, of course, look at this number, research and development. What's driving that number largely is Maryland and Virginia, but also down in Florida, and where you have, and Texas, as well as Huntsville, where you have a lot of space concentration. Visually, here's what it looks like in terms of current launch facilities, both government, FAA licensed, commercial. I put on the map there 3 red circles. If you see those circles, that's the areas in the Southeast that have a greater preponderance of gross regional product in their space economy. I just mentioned them, the Florida market, the Huntsville, and of course, Houston. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. I'm going to ask Alex to start us off, because Alex wrote a book. Maybe he wrote the book on the history of American space. And in preparing for this session, I read it. And Alex, I thought it'd be good to just give some perspective as to how we got to where we are today.
Well, I appreciate it, Dan. It's a real pleasure to be here. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that half of NASA centers are in the SEDC region. So half of them. And so I think there's certainly a lot of economic opportunity to talk about, but we'll get to that later on. When we think about the history of American space exploration, I think a lot of us start the story, either with Apollo or maybe with Sputnik. But the reality is that people in this country have been exploring space for well over 100 years before that. They began doing it first with astronomical observatories. And there were actually a large number of expensive astronomical observatory projects that were built in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. And as an economist, what was interesting to me is when you look at who funded them, it was not the federal government. It was individual communities like the Cincinnati Observatory, where a wonderfully 19th century named individual, Ormsby McKnight Mitchell, he got the citizens of Cincinnati to fund the 3rd largest telescope in the world in order to show the Tsar of Russia that here in a Republican country, where we don't have any monarchs, the people must become the patrons of science, which of course is the case today. And if it wasn't communities funding it, then it became wealthy individuals later on in the 19th century. It became people like James Lick, who just in California, or more kind of well-known people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. 95% of all of the astronomical observatories that were built in this country prior to the foundation of NASA were funded privately. You say, well, okay, maybe that's observatories. What about actual rocketry? Well, the first rocket pioneer in this country, Robert Goddard, he got the majority of his money from the Guggenheim family. And so what this told me is that the kind of history of American space exploration is much more a mix of kind of private ambitions and private interests melded with kind of governmental ambitions and objectives than it is kind of, I think, generally understood. And that's really kind of informed a lot of our strategy of how do we leverage the private sector, right? How do we leverage some of our current high net worth individuals and their ambitions, and how do we make sure that we get the most out of the tax dollar by working with them. But I think it's important to remember that, yeah, our desire to go in space is often a personal and intrinsic one. And the people who have that desire, they figure out whatever way to make a deal with somebody to make it happen.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ego involved here as well. And maybe, you know, we hear a lot about the dramatic interplanetary visions of Bezos and Musk, and I'm just wondering, you know, are these distractions, or is it actually driving this overall growth of the space economy?
I think it can be both.
Okay.
So, you know, I think you would not have the capabilities that we're now seeing come out of companies like SpaceX if they did not have this, you know, really motivating ambition for the workforce, right? People show up to work and they put in 100-hour work weeks, not just to make a buck, but because they're seeing themselves as part of a grand ambition, a grand project to extend humanity to other planets, to explore the cosmos. At the same time, as Kelli also well knows, when you look at this, you know, large economy, about 2/3 of it is simply communication satellites. That's the real source of the dollars. It's really satellites in space, sending bits back and forth, sending your phone calls, sending your bank transactions. That's the core of the economy. So, you know, if you're thinking that the kind of the big economic opportunities are going to be on Mars, then that might be a bit of a distraction. But without that ambition, without that kind of aspiration, you wouldn't really have the kind of workforce and the kind of talent going into the industry to begin with.
All right, thank you. Kelli, let's turn to you. You have one of the most fascinating jobs, I think, because you're really looking at the future of space and the economy. And from a commerce perspective, it just blows my mind. We're using this term space economy. Now, when I think of economy, I think of development and production, creative goods and services, and that there's a market of buyers and sellers. Do we have that today in space?
So the answer is yes, but not at the scale that we're pushing toward.
Okay.
And what I mean by that, so you alluded to the new space economy numbers. So as Dan mentioned, the Space Foundation puts out a space economy number annually that quantifies the year prior, and we just released our space economy number for 2023, which is $570 billion.
Wow.
It is a 7.4% increase from the previous year. And what's really important to note about that number is that it's 78% commercial revenue and 22% government spending. And so when you really break up that dichotomy to Alex's point, you realize how much of the space economy is really driven by space products, goods, and services for use on Earth. And what I actually think is really interesting when you unpack it is that most people touch space about 15 to 20 times a day, but they don't realize it because the products and services developed in space have been so seamlessly integrated into our lives that they act as this ubiquitous backbones for things that we do every day. And so when you actually start to think about the economic value, space touches every continent, country, county, citizen, and city. And so then when you start to peel back the onion, people can start to orient themselves within the economy and realize it. To answer your question more directly, there are goods and services produced, and as Alex mentioned, primarily it is satellite communications driven. But what I find really fascinating about this moment in time is we are having very real conversations about a cislunar economy. So really looking at commerce activities in low Earth orbit and eventually what's going to be built out on the moon that is driving new business models, new entrants, and new capabilities to enter the market. The challenge we're at right now is we're not really at the point where we pass demo to scale. And so space is hard, space is risky, space is very capital intensive, but we have a lot of really interesting companies and a lot of really interesting minds orienting toward what that can build out, but we are not at that full-blown marketplace yet.
Okay. And as running the Space Commerce Institute, you run demand courses, tailored workshops, even incubators.
Yeah.
In our conversations, you've used the word space adjacency. What does that mean?
It's my favorite term.
Your favorite term?
Yeah, so you will hear a lot of people in our industry, and you know, Alex alluded to the origins of the Apollo era, but we always like to say that this is not your grandfather's space industry anymore. It's not. Just contextually, there's over 92 countries that have active satellites in orbit. So it is extremely global and extremely distributed across the United States. The thing that I say about space adjacency, and you alluded to the workforce, is that the future of space is going to require every background, every skill set, every interest to actually grow where we're going. And there are so many industries that are going to be implicated in its growth and capabilities that are going to be relevant for its growth but don't realize it yet. So like advancements in manufacturing, robotics, artificial intelligence, digital engineering, all of these capabilities that have very robust industries in and of themselves, but do not realize that there's a place for them in the space. So my favorite thing to do is I say that I like to spin industries into space, is to get them to understand where they are relevant into the supply chain and then how to create a strategy that's scalable and sustainable that can actually mesh with what people think about traditional space.
Fascinating. And we're going to get into the segue into economic development and what our audience does every day. Before we go there, Alex, I want to follow up on your work with the International Space Station. You were NASA's man. My question has to do with the fact that it's been there for what, 2 decades, and it's been continuously somebody's been on up there. Do we know how many companies were formed because of the research, or how many new products have come to Earth as a result of that research?
Yeah, so great question. And to be clear, I was not NASA's man. We have the team down at Johnson Space Center. What I was responsible for is simply kind of leading the effort we call the National Lab. And that is a particular function of the International Space Station, which provides half of all of the resources on the space station. So these resources are crew time, cargo up mass, cargo down mass, right? These are the power, these are the key resources. Half of these resources are available to American companies, American universities, essentially for free. You got to do your own work to kind of do the integration of the hardware, but NASA provides that as a resource. And so I will say, for anyone who is interested in engaging with space, this is one of the best ways to get a university group, or if you're a company, to get engaged with space in a way that is very much supported and essentially subsidized by NASA. And so when we give away these resources, what happens? Well, we get new companies. I would point you to the ISS National Lab annual report. Every year, they report on how much private sector investment goes into the companies that have flown on the ISS. And I forget what last year's number was, but at least in one of the recent years, it was over $1 billion. Because going to the space station, operating some sort of hardware, some sort of payload, is a wonderful way to show investors that you've got what it takes to do a complicated project. So it's used by investors as a good signal of team competence, so that leads to investment. You asked about products. One of the most important ones is Keytruda. So Keytruda is an immunotherapy drug that helps with cancer patients. And they did some of the core research into how to design the drug on the International Space Station. They don't make the drug on the space station, but when they're trying to figure out how to design the molecules, doing the research in microgravity helps express different functions. You find right now that it's mostly a research lab. We don't yet have examples of a product that is made in space, every month and shipped down to Earth, and you get the shipment and you get to send it on. We're still trying to get there, and there's some early promising examples. The most interesting early promising example in my mind is essentially high opacity fiber optic cables. So when you go into microgravity, you've got no gravity, you've got no convection, and so that allows you to pull out these fiber optic cables at really, really high transparency. There's a lot of military applications for this. There's also potentially, if you can do this really, really cost effectively, you could start replacing fiber optic cables on the ground, and that would increase your bit rate, it would reduce your cost. We're a ways away from that, but that's the kind of things that we are seeing emerge, and it's a really exciting area.
Okay, so the ISS is going to be transitioning, and there'll be commercial space stations. How are they going to come about? I mean, we were just talking about the business case. What's the business case then for commercial stations?
Yep.
And because of your role, I have to ask, what's the government, how is the government going to be involved in that?
Sure. So we're still right now in the kind of formulation and early execution of the CLDP, NASA loves acronyms, Commercial LEO Destinations Program. And we have done a number of awards under that program. We've made one award to a company that is allowed to now dock one of their private modules to the International Space Station. First time that we've ever cleared that, so that's one potential path for development. There's other paths for development as well. We've also given about 3 different awards, over $100 million each to companies to start developing their commercial space stations. But this is just the beginning. The real key comes when we buy services for these space station providers to host our astronauts, allow them to train, to become familiar with microgravity environment, to become familiar with doing research in space, as well as doing our science and technology payloads. We have a constant need to be pushing the frontier of science in space and technology in space, and we're going to be doing that on commercial space stations in the future once we get around to retiring the ISS. So NASA is going to be involved as a customer. That's our key role. One of the things that we have been trying to avoid, for reasons that I'm sure people here in this room will understand, is we're trying to avoid getting involved with the regulatory environment. We allow our good friends in the Department of Commerce and the Department of Transportation. That's really where the regulation happens. We're a mission-based agency. We want to focus on getting the best science, on going as far as we can, on getting our astronauts the experience that they need to go far. That's our role, and we know that there's a rich interagency dialogue about how that regulation is going to happen in the future. It's going to be complex.
Okay, all right. I could ask so many more questions about your roles, but what I want to do is segue now from space to Earth and the role for economic developers. Clearly, the space to Earth market seems enormous. It really does. But what does it mean for our profession? Will what we do a decade from now be so much different from what we're doing today?
I can start on this one. So yes, so you are accurate that the space to Earth market, so just for clarification, there's really 2 main market definitions when we talk about space. So there's the space to Earth market, which are goods and services produced in space for use on Earth. That is the bulk. And then there's the space to space market, which are goods and services produced in space for use in space. And that's really where we're pushing toward when we're going to have really an economic vibrancy in space, because that's really taking Earth out of the equation, being able to produce in space, manufacture in space, mine in space, all those things. But really right now, the cornerstone of the economy is the space to Earth market, and it is rapidly growing. I think what makes it exciting though is that for economic developers and for communities, there's just more of the value chain to engage with. And partially it's driven by the satellite equation. Yeah. So I think it's no surprise to anybody that commercial satellites are just absolutely booming across the board. Just to put things into context, roughly there's I think about 12,000 active satellites in orbit. There's already 20,000 plus licenses for launch, and by the year 2030, they think there's going to be at least 58,000 satellites. So just the amount of information and data and imagery is already finding its way in other industries like insurance industries. A specific segment called parametric insurance is now able to insure disaster response to like a millimeter, because they have the kind of accuracy from what they're able to actually pull down from space. And so we don't know what that future looks like, because more things in space, more complexity, potentially more regulation, but it's more opportunity for people like quantum computing and digital engineering and data analytics and all of these other industries that utilize those capabilities. And they could utilize those capabilities for purely terrestrial bound aspects. Like, how many of you guys checked the weather app today or used Uber? I mean, that's connected to space. And so just our ability to do things faster, do things quicker, and do things different is going to really change. For cities like Savannah, port authorities, right, position, navigation, and timing is what replies to GPS and all of those coordinates. It's because of space. And so we're just going to have new ways of conducting business and capabilities that we just don't know.
Yeah, and I'll say, it was fun when the Office of Communication reached out to me after the SEDC folks kind of reached out and said, we usually get a lot of requests from economic development councils, it got me thinking about kind of what are the ways in which the world will change thanks to space. And you know, looking at the booths outside, you already got a GIS booth out there, right? Already space-based imagery is already changing how you can do site selection, how you can kind of look at the environment, how it's changing. It's one way it's already changing. And good conversation last night about the way in which space-based internet terminals that are now becoming incredibly affordable are changing rural connectivity, right? Broadband is now able to get out in much easier ways to more rural areas. That's creating a new economic dynamic there as well. You know, but for me, I think one of the ones that's going to be most interesting is essentially you're having a manufacturing boom in space. And one of the numbers that's really growing strongest, some of the space services are going strong. You know, we talked about this last night as well. You know, there's satellite internet, it's going up. Satellite TV is going down. But one of the other things that's going up strongly is simply more manufacturing of satellites, rockets, rocket components. And what that means is the need for new manufacturing plants. Already we've been seeing significant growth in Alabama and Florida. There's no reason that couldn't extend to other areas in the region as well.
All right, this raises two questions. And one is, if this is the future, it is, will we as a nation need the chips equivalent for this race into space? That's question one.
Well,
let's take that one first.
I was just going to say, from your lips to Congress's ears.
Well.
Ditto that.
So does the private sector alone can't pull this off at the scale we need? Is that what you're saying?
So for manufacturing, one of the real drivers has been government investment. NASA's budget has been largely flat, but one of the economic stories that is maybe less reported on is the growth in the Space Force's budget. Space Force was, of course, created relatively recently. It was created out of existing parts of the Air Force, and people came over from all the different services, but its budget growth has been very significant, and that's driving a lot of the manufacturing numbers. At the end of the day, a lot of the things that are not satellites communicating with each other are, at the end of the day, underpinned by government funding. Earth observation as an industry is underpinned by government funding. Human space flight is certainly underpinned by government funding. As much as I'm thankful that we have resource billionaires who are engaged with human space flight, I like to point out that depending on where their stock price is, NASA's human space flight program would bankrupt each of them in about 10 to 20 years. Because it is a significant expenditure, and they are recipients of taxpayer dollars to achieve public missions. And so that really is still kind of what we're doing. This is still a public mission that is being pursued. What we're getting is more bang for the buck by figuring out how to leverage private capabilities, how to create market opportunities out of these. I think that's still the right strategy, rather than trying to say, hey, the government's got to get out of this. It's still really critical.
And I think a key component of that, which a lot of people don't realize, is that the government is still the primary customer of space technology. So that will shift at some point, but there's a critical role for both. And I think part of the problem when, I personally think that space has a bit of an optics problem, a little bit. So we mentioned in the beginning that everyone thinks that space is cool, like we don't have that problem. But the problem is that when people think about space, they think about it in these mythological terms, and like you said, they think about Mars and just these far-flung things, which is really important, but it obscures the fact that we have this robust ecosystem of goods and services being used by the government and commercial entities, and so the space market can be creative, stable, and risky all at the same time. But it's really difficult for investors or other folks to be able to locate within the market what is the proper place to invest in, because it either gets too nuanced too quickly or it gets way too esoteric. And so it's really difficult sometimes to quantify what a good market investment is and what is actually good to put development into, because the market isn't really talked about often holistically in terms of what's going to drive economic value.
Okay. Let's then approach this a different way. Traditional economic development sites and manufacturing facilities to produce all that junk we're sending up into space. Does the Southeast have a competitive advantage? When we project out and we say, well, where's all this going to take place? I showed the map of the United States. It showed a pretty heavy concentration. We saw that 40% of the manufacturing of the space industry is now within the southeastern states. Is this going to be something that is beneficial for the entire United States and all states, or will there be, for some reason or not, more of a tilt toward this part?
As I said, already half of the NASA centers are in the SEDC region. And so there's a lot of opportunity there. That doesn't just mean that there are NASA contracts. It also means that there are NASA education programs in the region. The workforce certainly is second to none in the country. Huntsville, Alabama is one of the beacons of the space industry. Yeah. And University of Alabama Huntsville produces a non-trivial portion of the nation's aerospace engineers. I do think it's an interesting question of kind of how do you make sure that the economic benefits can extend more regionally, right? We tend to have a very kind of state-based center focused, and that may or may not have anything to do with where various senators end up on various appropriations committees. But I think the interstate connectivity pieces are really worth exploring. There is going to be an increasing need as we have more and more satellites, more and more manufacturing in the sector, for more and more manufacturing facilities. And I think that's kind of where I would be looking at is, okay, when you're looking at these contracts and you're looking at companies who are putting out kind of new bids and new proposals, right? Where is the excess capacity going to be coming from? And there's going to be some of that. There's no question, right? We're seeing a growing industry, and so then it's really up to the various states to figure out, whether or not they can get that business.
All right. Okay. I'm gonna open it up to questions pretty soon. So if you do have one, try to go to the microphones. There's one to the right over there and one to the left, and we'll get there. At last year's SEDC conference, we held a plenary on the stage. I moderated that with, I think we had about 5 state commerce directors, and the title of that session was, "Is it smart to collaborate with the competition?" Economic development is so competitive, and the answer was a clear, emphatic, yes, it does make sense. In fact, we're having to do this more and more, finding ways for different states, different regions to cross those borders to make their markets work, to be more competitive. So, taking this to space, the question becomes, with all of the countries you mentioned, Kelli, that have something going on up there right now, and the ISS being decommissioned, more commercial activity up there. What's that going to mean in terms of keeping track on who's doing what and collaborating?
Globally or domestically?
Globally.
Yeah, so I would say globally.
I mean, here you have the International Space Station that was the premise of it was this is for international cooperation,
Yes.
etc. So if we don't have that, and now we have more and more commercial activity all around the world,
Yeah.
how do we
Well, I'll say that actually, in many ways, international cooperation is moving to the moon. So already 42 countries have signed what are called the Artemis Accords, and these are commitments by 42 countries around the world to essentially the sustainable development and peaceful uses of the moon.
All right.
We have already promised, in fact, to take 1 Canadian around the moon as part of a partnership with NASA on the Artemis program, and 2 Japanese astronauts down to the lunar surface in exchange for a number of their contributions, including a pressurized lunar rover on their lunar surface. Think about like a really big RV, but for the moon. And so the Japanese have agreed to build that. They seem like a good choice. And so we've already committed to the first international exploration of the moon. I think this is one of the parts of this that doesn't get nearly enough coverage. We have already committed to taking an international cohort down to the lunar surface, and that's expected to grow in the future. So the ISS, kind of may at some point have to be retired, but the plan is to continue that cooperation because we recognize that if we don't figure out how to cooperate in space and keep it peaceful and for economic and social benefits, then we all lose, right? The whole planet loses.
Yeah.
And to continue that thread just about the cislunar space, and particularly looking at some of the infrastructure and architecture that is meant to be built out in low Earth orbit, it has to be integrated and it has to be collaborative. Because you're not gonna have one country or one company that can build and sustain all of it. And what I've heard from a lot of different companies, especially, there's an Space loves acronyms, it's called ISAM, it's in Space Assembly, Service to Manufacturing, and essentially what it looks at is that space to Earth, being able to manufacture, design, build in space. They welcome other companies that are doing similar things because they're just at this precipice where they're going to only collectively rise together because they will be able to either consolidate, leverage IP, be able to integrate capabilities for something that's better down the road. And so it very much is this collaborative environment. I will say though that there still are friends and foes in space. And so there is a mix of commercial, civil, and national security activities, but generally people are approaching space, as Alex mentioned, in this collective humanitarian way to really push the boundaries of what's possible.
Oh, you just gave me one to swing at. You said there are friends and foes. Let's talk about foes, because we've heard that whoever controls space controls the world. So that's a scary thought. Obviously, there was a treaty after the Apollo for non-proliferation of nuclear, and then Reagan had his theories, his thoughts on Star Wars, which morphed over the years. Now we have a Space Force. But as we move into more commercialization of space, will the defense budget have to rise to protect these investments and our interest and against rogue actors? I mean, that's kind of scary that all of this is up there. It's phenomenal, but is it in jeopardy? Is it a target?
So I'll start by saying that the defense budgets already have risen, primarily driven by the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. So last year, military spending across the board when it comes to space assets was an 18% increase globally. And it was really because space, and Alex, I'm curious your perspective on this, but I think it was one of the times where in more recent history they realized that it is critical infrastructure in terms of what it's able to do geopolitically, and also just the congested and contested environment of it. So increase is already happening.
Yeah, I'll just say, we recognize for a long time that space is an absolutely critical force multiplier for our forces. Modern U.S. military capacity is highly reliant on space. And it is becoming a more fragile environment, and that is reason for concern. And so, on the civil side, for us, that's about kind of keeping lines of communication open. Folks on the other side of the river have different perspectives. And so it's definitely a serious issue, and some of the folks should read up on the latest situation.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to keep looking at those microphones. If you do have a question, we only have a few more minutes. Please step up, and I'll try to keep my eyes open for you. So let me shift to a more positive. And that is that why are we in space? We're in space to benefit Earth, right? It's humanitarian. At least that's what I think that means. What does it mean to you?
Yeah.
What are your greatest, hopes for Earth's future because of all this space activity?
I mean, for me, I think that spaceflight is one of the most beautiful expressions of kind of our culture. Right? We are a people who believe that we can create stories that involve us going and visiting other planets and coming back from those planets and sharing with each other stories about what we learned, what we did, and how that changed how we see ourselves and how we see our planet and our family and our friends. And that's what we see every time. Every time you meet an astronaut, right? They've all gone through a journey. They've all gone through a transformational journey for themselves, and then they want to come back and kind of share what they've seen. And I think that the more we do of that, the better chance we have of bettering ourselves, not just kind of as people, but as a nation, because we also learn about how to leverage new technologies that have now made our life, I would say, better. You may or may not like Uber, but it works pretty well from the airport, right? These are things that are now improvements in our life. Same thing in terms of Earth observation. Satellite internet, if you're from a rural part of the country, you didn't have broadband, and then you got, a new satellite internet terminal, pretty good. These are things that we have learned because we have this kind of, this cultural ambition to go out to the stars to begin with. And so for me, I just hope that we never kind of give up that ambition, that we keep on trying to go as far as we can. Leave that as a marker for the next generations, encourage them to go farther, and the process continues.
I agree with that, completely agree with that. It's interesting, a lot of astronauts have come back and they said that when they view the Earth collectively, they realize that we're all the same, right?
Yeah.
They don't really see borders and stuff, they just see the human race, which is a beautiful sentiment. I think to bring it more local and just follow up on the future generations being excited, I think truly to have that deeper connection to space and understand how it affects us, but for me, it's also for people to not self-select out of the future and being part of it. Because there is going to be so much more opportunities and parts of the value chain to engage with. And so I'm a sociologist who's been working in science and space for 17 years, and I never thought I would do that. So the more opportunities for people who may not be STEM oriented to realize that there is a job and a career for them, and to self-select in and want to be part of it, that's what I'm really excited about.
Yeah, and I want to build on one thing there. If interview on the state side of economic development, look at something called the NASA CubeSat Launch Initiative, the educational launch of nanosatellites. NASA will fly for free a small satellite built by your universities, and all it takes is dedicated students, dedicated professors, about $50,000 a parts.
Really?
And NASA will launch for free. We've got about 38 states that have done this already. I think we have about 46 or 47 of them that are kind of manifest and ready to go. But even if your state's already built one, I'm sure there are universities in your state that haven't. This is one of the best ways to build STEM workforce for a low cost and high visibility that you can possibly find.
Wow. We could be here all afternoon. I know we've hit the time, but we're going to ask for the grace of our host to let us go for a little bit longer. We do have one question. Shoot.
Hi, I'm Savannah Walker with the Economic Development Partnerships of North Carolina. This is more of like a self-indulgent question. So my master's degree is in history, and I just kind of want to know what your thoughts are on what we can learn from the history on Earth that could maybe potentially help us in the future. They say history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So what can we learn from, I guess the golden age of piracy, the whole idea of manifest destiny in moving west, imperialism, what can we learn from that regarding space?
Just one quick question to tie it up,
She asked it of the right person.
Yeah, I don't know if we can kind of condense it into one set of lessons, but I do think that asking that question is really important. When we signed the Outer Space Treaty, when the Outer Space Treaty was ratified by the US Senate in 1967, that treaty basically said that there will be no appropriation by states of territory in space. And that was done mostly so that neither the Soviet Union or the US could kind of claim all of them when that happened. But the reality was that President Johnson, at the time he started kind of pursuing this and he was vice president, but he was president when the treaty was signed. And he believed that a different model needed to pertain in space if we are to attain essentially a better version of ourselves. And so I think trying to figure out how we can not repeat the mistakes, what new structures there might be, and frankly being willing to experiment, right? Being willing to experiment and learn new lessons as well, not just the old lessons. I think that's important. Space is a completely different environment, and so we don't have to port all of our old understandings, even if some of our behaviors may nonetheless be very similar. We can try new things. So I think one of the best lessons is to figure out how we can try new things in space.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, would you like a follow-up?
No, I was just saying thank you. Thank you.
All right. Why don't we all thank Alex and Kelly? I think many in this room will look back on this day and say, I remember when, and they learned something, and we thank you very much for being here. Let's give them a round of applause.